Now we're going to do the HTMX approach to editing query sets. Now before I even jump into this approach, we already have HTMX editing query sets. It's already working. We can do it in here with the ingredients. But what I want to do is take a look at another kind of approach and the way I would actually go about doing this. And so that actually has to do with the question of how often am I really going to be editing this data? Like if I go into a recipe, am I going to be going in to edit the ingredients or the description or the directions? To me, it's going to be one of those things, the descriptions or the direction. Like instead of being 10 minutes, maybe we change it to 20 minutes. And that's something that you would end up doing, right? And that's really what I kind of intuit about this project. The other thing is, like, when we want to make a dynamic project, should we always have the edit forms showing up, or should we have a little edit button when you want to make those edits? So this will show you how to do both of those things in a way I think that makes sense. Okay, so first and foremost, let's go ahead and jump into our forms.html, and I'm going to get rid of this if form set. The whole thing, all the way down to there. So we got rid of add more as well, which of course will update this to like that. So as it stands right now, I actually can no longer save this data. Notice it's not saving. It's not giving me an indication of why it's not saving. I do know why, and that's because I removed the form set. Because in the view, in views.py for this update view, we have the form set and the form, and then our condition to save anything is if they're both valid. The form set is invalid, but it's not invalid in a way that makes the form invalid. So I'm going to get rid of the form set stuff in here as well. We no longer need it. And it's good to know about, but we definitely do not need it. So now inside of here, we'll just go ahead and say if form is valid and just do form.save. That's it. We don't need to do anything else in here, most likely. And then I'll go ahead and add in that message still. Get rid of these. And there we go. So this doesn't change the create view at all. In fact, it keeps the create view exactly as is. Like I'm not going to change the create view because I knew I was working towards this, right? And so now we've got this as a save element here. We no longer have the form set. It's a much more simple view and a lot easier to manage overall. And so we're actually going to be duplicating this same concept a few times for the recipe ingredients. But before I get there, let's go ahead and actually verify that this is working. So editing any given recipe from 20 minutes, let's go ahead and bring it down to 10. We hit save, says data saved, we refresh, we're good. Okay, so no big surprises there. All of that was done through HTMX as well. And of course, if for some reason the HTMX is down, as in somebody blocks JavaScript or whatever, we still have a fallback. This will still work, right? And it will just verify whether or not the request is HTMX. I think that's just so nice. It's very, very nice once you actually try and see these things happen yourself. So now what I want to do though is on my create update, this actual template, this is where I'm actually going to be bringing in my ingredients now. So H3, we're going to bring in the ingredients again. And I want to actually loop through here. So for ingredient in object.get, what do we call it? So we could use the recipe ingredients set, but I actually want to use the instance method for get ingredients children so that I can get all of those ingredient objects. And then we'll do in for. So in here, we'll just go ahead and list off the ingredients. I'll put it into a div, and then we'll do ingredient and dot name. Probably, what was it, quantity. And finally, the unit. The three main things that we need. So there we go. Simple enough. We might actually want to reverse that order. We want to put the quantity and unit first, and then the ingredient name. Great. Okay, so now we've got these ingredients. I just want a little button in here that says edit. But before I do even that little button in there, we need to think about HTMX. What is it really good about doing? It's good about rendering out a small block of data or partial data. So before I even set up the HTMX for this, I want to create a new partial, and it's going to be the ingredient detail.html, or actually ingredient inline.html. The reason it's inline is because it's sort of in this list here. So I'm going to call it inline. And so I'm going to cut this stuff out, paste it in here. Now, whenever you're using templates, in my opinion, it's best to use more generic variables there. So object instead of ingredient, just like that. Okay, cool. So now the template itself has object in there. We're looking good. So going back into the create update, now we're just going to go ahead and say include. This, of course, will be recipes, partials, ingredient, inline.html, and then with ingredient, or rather object equaling to the ingredient here. Of course, we could change this to be an object, but the downside of that in particular is potentially this create update has an object in it. It doesn't, but potentially it might, right? Or actually, it definitely does. It's right there. So we don't want to use object and object. It's going to conflict with the main one. In any case, we now have our template in here. Okay, so let me break this down just so it's clear as to what's going on. So we save that. We refresh in here. Same data. Okay, cool. So now with this ingredient inline, I can make a button here. And we'll just give it an empty thing. And we'll say edit. Save that. Refresh. And what do you know? We got this edit button here. That's pretty nice. So now I need to turn this button into another kind of click event. But in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to replace this element with the actual form that we want to use to edit it. Okay. So naturally, before I even change the template, let's set up the logic for that view. And in fact, it's actually very similar to what we did here, but actually a little bit closer to this recipe detail HX that we did before. In fact, it's almost identical to this. So I'm going to go ahead and come down to the bottom. And now it's instead of recipe detail, we're going to go ahead and call it recipe ingredient detail. Now, it is still an inline technically. That's how I actually want to think about it. But this is actually going to get the detail, whatever that ends up being. And so something I didn't cover in this one is basically saying if request.htmx, then we want to continue everything. If it's not that, then we're going to go ahead and return this not found. And in this case, actually, if it's not an HTMX request, this is where we can actually raise HTTP 404. Okay, so that actually makes sense to bring that in again in that case. Cool. So I can also bring this in up to our other one that we had in there as well, so that we don't have users accidentally finding these HTMX views and seeing what's coming back. Okay, cool. So now here we are. We've got our HTMX view, this great block that's showing the recipe. That's the actual parent. That is something we actually still want to have. So this, instead of being object, it's simply just parent object. And if that's none, then of course, not found or an error occurred. So now what we want to do is grab, based off of this ID, we want to grab a new recipe ingredient instance. Okay, so this is actually going to be our detail or update view, right? So in other words, I want to have either the form showing up with nothing in it or the form showing up with something in it. So no longer it's the detail view. We're just going to call it the update view. Okay. So if I actually get this data, what I want to do is render out the form. So that means that if I have a parent object and I have an instance, so let's go ahead and do instance of the recipe ingredient, objects.get parent, or rather recipe, is equal to that parent object, and then the ID equals to ID. Okay, so hopefully your red flags are going off or something like that, is we're using this ID twice. So what I need to do is actually use parent ID and then just regular ID. Okay, so the parent ID is just for that one, and then the instance itself, the actual recipe ingredient, we can also think of this as the object, but I believe it as instance, and I'll update my context as well, and then use the different partial. So this is going to be ingredient inline.html. Okay, so we've got an instance, we've got a parent ID. We will solve the two variables coming in a little bit, but there's a really good chance that we might not have an instance. So if we're using this to create, update, and create things, we can also say instance is none. And then if the ID is not none, then we'll go ahead and grab that instance. Now this is also possibly not in there, right? So yet again, we can use this same try block or a similar try block, but instead of it being for the parent object, we actually put it in for the instance itself. Just like that. Okay. Now the question is, do we need to return not found? Well, no, we can actually just return an empty form, and that's fine. Okay. So now we actually declare the form itself. So form being, well, what's the form going to be? Of course, it's our recipe ingredient form, like we used in the form set itself. And now it's going to be request.post or none, and the instance being the instance. Right? So in this case, it's actually giving me the instance being none. That is a possibility, which would give it just an empty model form. Otherwise, it's going to give me the actual instance that exists for that ID. Okay. So now we'll go ahead and just say if form.is valid. Then we'll go ahead and say our new object is equal to form.save commit being false. And we'll go ahead and say if instance is none, then we'll go ahead and say new object.recipe is equal to the parent object, and then new object.save. None of this as it relates to the form should be new, hopefully. Okay. So what actually is happening here is on the form itself, we're going to go ahead and this is where we want to render out this context right here. So what I'm going to do is actually move this context up, paste it in here, and add in the form. Okay. So this inline context will replay all of this. So this sort of assumes that it's done. The form has been edited, and now it's going to show the detail itself. So that detail should be related to this, right? So context and object being to that new object, because it's possible that the instance is none. That's kind of the idea. So down here, then, we just want to render out the form. So we don't actually have a form yet, so we definitely need to add that. So let's go back into our data here in the templates. And now we'll use ingredient form as a partial. Okay. We'll take forms.html as reference and bring that into our ingredient form here. This time, I actually don't need for field and form. We don't need to do that. We can just do form as and p. There we go. I'm also going to get rid of this message here. And there we go. Okay, cool. So now we've got the ingredient inline, we've got the form, and we have the view. There's probably things that I still need to improve on this, but for now, that's pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring this into my URLs. And it's right here. Let's bring it in. This time I'm going to use this HX again, but above it, I'm going to pass in the ingredient, and then we'll pass in another ID here. Okay, and this also will be HX and ingredient. There we go. So this is HX ingredient detail, just like that. Okay, so notice that we have these two arguments here. They're the same. We need to change this one to parent_ID. That actually solves everything for us in terms of the actual view itself, right? So parent ID and ID. Cool. So right here, of course, this will still be triggered. The reason I did /ingredient is because I also want to have the ability to say new and get rid of this ID. That same view can actually handle both of these, which is why I actually have all of it set up to handle both of them. And so that's what we've got here now. Great. So this is actually going to be detail update, really. So we could say update or detail. Doesn't really matter. This could also be create. Great. So now that we've got this, let's go ahead and implement some things. First off, on the button itself. Okay, so where do I want this to go? Well, I want to run hx-get, and I want to get it to the edit of whatever this object would be. So in this case, I'll do object.get edit URL. Okay, that's really straightforward. I think we still definitely need to get that object URL. Next, what we'll need to do is actually set a target of some kind. So I need to replace an element. I need to replace this entire thing. So what I want to do here is set this equal to some argument in here. So I'm going to go ahead and say ingredient-object.id. So this argument or ID is what's going to be replaced. So that means then I can actually do hx-target to replace a different element, right? So this is probably a little new, but this target will then go off of that. So this entire button here will be replaced with whatever happens at this endpoint here. Okay. And then I want the trigger, and that trigger is going to be hx trigger equaling to click. So when this button is clicked, it's going to do a get call here, and then it's going to change the target. Great. So let's go ahead and implement this get edit URL on my model itself. Let's go into the model for it. And not in the recipe now, but recipe ingredient. We're going to go ahead and come in here, get edit URL, and I want to return reverse of something. Okay. So what is the actual URL name? Let's break this down and go into URLs. The URL name to edit it would be this one right here. It actually has two arguments that we'd pass. So hx-ingredient detail. Let's actually stick with, instead of calling it get edit URL, but get edit, like get HTMX edit URL in both places. That way we know which view to use. And the detail view is going to be self.id. That's true, but the other one, the other argument we need to pass in. So I'll go ahead and say keyword args equals to parent ID, and that is self.recipe.id. And then it's just simply the ID being self.id. Okay, so this actually should give us the correct URL to call on my ingredient inline. And once it does that, it should go here and then eventually render out the form itself. So let's go ahead and save this. The form we still need to update, also the post data itself, which we'll do in a second. So we refresh in here. If I click edit, now it shows up. How cool is that? And if I refresh, of course, it's not there. But that is a very comprehensive way of what we've been working towards with HTMX. Hopefully at this point, nothing I did in the views or the templates is complicated. Sure, I have a few complicated logic in here, and you might even consider breaking these two things out. Like one is for creating something, the other one is for updating something. But I tend to not use the same code, or I tend to not repeat myself as much as possible in my code. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and actually update the form. Okay, so what we want to do here is we have an object coming through with this context, right? So I can actually base it off of the object, or what I could do is say the URL is going to be another context object as well. So in the case of the form, not in case of the edit button will always be off of that instance method, but the form method, the actual hx post, that is one I'm going to do based off of the view, because the view is going to be the only one rendering out this form at some point. So what is the URL then? Well, if there is an instance, it's going to be instance.get hx URL or get hx edit URL, right? If instance. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and use something different. Now, what is that something different? Well, it's going to be the reversed URL of the create one, this right here. Okay. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, again, it's going to be create. So let's come back into our view. It's going to be reverse of recipes and create. Let's go ahead and make sure we have reverse in here. I think we did add it in somewhere. There it is right there. So it's almost identical to that. So reverse, and then keyword args equals to ID of parent object.id. Okay. So if you're not familiar with these inline things, we can look at it like this, being none, or really being this as the default. And then say if instance, then just changing the URL here. And bring back that context like that. So that's certainly another way to write that URL line out instead of having it all in one. Okay, so now that I've got that, let's go ahead and add in this URL. And so it should give me a URL one way or the other. Either it's to the create method or it's to the instance method. Okay, so now in my form, we'll go ahead and say if URL, then we'll go ahead and do the URL, else we'll go ahead and use period, and then end if. Okay. And HX swap, outer HTML. Now in this case, we can change the target as well. So ID being the ingredient form or something like that. I'll leave it out. We'll just keep the form in here. Okay, cool. So now we've got this edit. So let's give it a shot. Click on edit. Looks like I might have a server error because I clicked on something and it's not loading. Sure enough, I do. So let's go ahead and go back in here. And we got a create not found. So the actual ID is not found for this one. So let's go back in and take a look at our views. Oh yes, I already know what it is. It's the actual lookup itself. So in the update view, the URL, this right here should not say ID, but rather parent ID because we kept it in as parent ID. Cool. Let's try that again. Click edit. Sure enough, there it is. And this time I'm going to go ahead and say ounces, hit save. It saved it seemingly, and then it gave me nothing in return. Okay, so that's good, kind of. We refresh in here. It actually did save the data, so that's a good start. But if we go back into the view, let's take a look at what's happening here. Okay, so the object is the instance up here, but I actually made a mistake here and it said context instead of the actual object. And so there we go. Context object equals to whatever that new object is. And so 500 ounces is a lot. Let's change it back to being, I don't know, 16 ounces. We hit save and there we go. So that is how we do it. And this should actually bring everything together what we've done so far. Now, to potentially improve this, we would use another method, but I'm actually not going to be using that other method. Instead, what I'm going to do is add in this same button here. I actually want to add this button in also to create a new one, right? So it's very similar to this, but it's actually closer to this URL right here. So how do we go about doing that? How do we actually have something that creates it? So I actually want to grab this same URL here and bring it up to my detail, my recipe update view, and bring it in like this. So the parent object in this case is just ID, right? So this gives me that same URL, and this is going to be a new recipe URL. This one I'm going to go ahead and add in here, right, into that context. So now in my view, inside of my template, we got this create update here. Now we can do under these ingredients to say if new recipe URL. This probably should be if new ingredient URL. Okay, so update the view with that new context. Okay, so new ingredient URL. Come back in here. If it is there, we're going to go ahead and do that same thing. This time, I'm going to give the ID a little bit different. So the ID of recipe or ingredient create. And then our button HX get equals to this ingredient URL. The HX trigger is going to be click. the HX target is going to be this ID. And then we'll go ahead and say add new or add ingredient. Save that. Coming back in, click on add ingredient. I'll go ahead and say, let's say, I don't know, roast beef, 123 pounds. That is so much roast beef. We hit save. There it is. Okay. So notice it actually did not place it in the right area, right? So I actually want to leave this in here. And so there it is. And then what we do is down here, we use HX swap and before end. So this should append it to the end of this create item here. And so we come back in, add new ingredient, something, 12 ounces. Here we go. Oh, we made a mistake. Let's call it something and save. And add more and more and so on. Okay, cool. So we have now completely changed it from a form set to HTMX and the proper approach that I would do. Now, of course, we don't have a delete method in here, any sort of delete button at all. And we also have the problem of if I bring in empty data here, hey, it's not a problem. If I try to save it, it will tell me that these are required. So let's go ahead and do one more thing here and give a bunch of gibberish and try and hit save. What do you know? It actually validates it for me too. That I think is great. And of course, if I did add a bunch of ingredients and just never saved them and refresh, they just go away. It's all good.